In middle school, we started learning about the parts of an atom, including electrons, neutrons, and protons. For some reason, I had trouble remembering where each part belonged, and had a particularly hard time with protons. I couldn't wrap my head around why they mattered so much, stuck inside the nucleus while electrons zipped around freely. My science teacher, Mr. Jenkins, kept it simple. Protons define what an element is, change the number of protons, and you change the element itself. But that explanation just muddled things further for me. How could something so tiny hold that kind of power? Determined to get it straight, I hit the school library after class, flipping through books on atomic theory. Most of it was dry and confusing, but then I found something different, a dusty old book titled Quantum Mysteries, the Hidden World of Subatomic Particles. It was way over my head, but one chapter grabbed my attention, Protons and the Quantum Consciousness Hypothesis. The author claimed protons might be more than just particles, that their quantum states could somehow tie into human consciousness, influencing the brain in ways science couldn't yet explain. It sounded crazy, but I was hooked. The book mentioned a rumored experiment where scientists messed with the spin of protons in someone's brain, supposedly boosting their mental abilities. There were no hard details, just whispers of something unverified. Still, my imagination ran wild. What if I could try something like that? Maybe it'd help me finally understand protons, or even make me smarter. I knew it was a long shot, but I couldn't let it go. A few late-night Google searches led me to sketchy online forums about DIY quantum experiments. Most posts were gibberish, but one stood out. Some anonymous user described building a proton resonance field with stuff you could find at home, magnets, copper wire, and a small radioactive source. They claimed it could tweak proton behavior nearby. It sounded like nonsense, but I was desperate to prove I could master this. So, I gathered what I needed, a couple of fridge magnets, copper wire from an old radio, and for the radioactive bit, I cracked open a smoke detector to get the tiny americium-241 inside. I'd read it was safe in small doses, probably not the smartest move, but I wasn't thinking straight. Following the forum post, I wrapped the wire around the magnets, hooked it to a battery, and set the smoke detector piece in the middle. It looked like a junkyard science project, and I didn't expect much, but I flipped the switch anyway. Nothing happened at first, then a low hum started, faint but steady. I leaned in closer, and out of nowhere, a wave of dizziness slammed into me. The room tilted and I gripped my desk to keep from falling. When it passed, everything looked the same, but I felt sharper. My thoughts were clearer and more focused. I grabbed my science textbook and read the section on protons again. This time, it all made sense. Perfect, vivid sense. I could picture the nucleus, the protons locked in place, defining the atom's identity. It was like my brain had leveled up. For a couple of days, I was thrilled. I aced a pop quiz without even studying. But then, things got weird. That first night, I had a dream so real it didn't feel like a dream at all. I was a soldier in some muddy battlefield, bullets whizzing past, yelling orders in a language I didn't recognize. The next night, I was a scientist in a sterile lab, scribbling equations about protons on a whiteboard. These weren't random dreams, they were detailed, like memories, except they weren't mine. Soon the weirdness crept into the day. I'd catch flashes of people out of the corner of my eye, shadowy figures that vanished when I turned. Whispers echoed in empty rooms, too faint to make out. At first I tried to blame exhaustion, but then it escalated. One night, I woke up standing in my kitchen, clutching a knife, with no clue how I got there. My heart pounded as I dropped it and bolted back to bed. Something was seriously wrong. Deep down, I knew it tied back to that stupid experiment. I dug out Quantum Mysteries again, reading the Proton chapter more carefully. Tucked in the fine print was a warning. Altering proton states in living organisms may cause unpredictable quantum entanglement, potentially linking consciousnesses across realities or timelines. My stomach dropped. Had I tangled my mind with someone or something else? I had to fix this, but when I went to dismantle the device, it wasn't on my desk where I left it. Panic set in. Had I moved it during one of my blackouts? I tore my room apart. Nothing. Maybe my parents took it, but they'd have grounded me for life if they'd found something that sketchy. I was running out of options. The next day, I cornered Mr. Jenkins after class. "Can I talk to you about something weird?" I asked, my voice shaky. He nodded, looking worried. "What's going on?" I spilled it all, the book, the device, the dreams, and the knife incident. I expected him to laugh or call me delusional, but instead he just frowned. "Quantum entanglement is real, in theory," he said slowly. But you can't manipulate it with household junk. Maybe it's stress playing tricks on you. It's not in my head, I snapped. I'm losing control. He paused. Sleepwalking can happen under stress. You should see a doctor. Ultimately, I left feeling dismissed. He didn't get it, but honestly, I couldn't blame him. Who would believe something like this? That night, the dreams hit harder. I was in a lab, strapped to a chair, surrounded by scientists in white coats. The proton matrix is stable, one said. We can proceed with the consciousness transfer. A machine whirred, and a jolt ripped through me. Then, nothing. Just black. I woke up screaming, soaked in sweat. That wasn't just a dream. It felt like I lived it. Digging online, I found old declassified files about Cold War experiments, crazy stuff like mind control. There was something else too, something called proton resonance therapy. Was my device tapping into that? I messaged the forum user who posted the instructions, begging for a way out. Hours later, they replied, "You've opened a door that should have stayed shut. The resonance field can entangle consciousnesses, but it's unstable. Recreate it and disrupt it fast to break the link. Warning, you might lose your mind in the process." Lose my mind? I didn't even know what that meant, but I was literally out of choices. First, I had to find the device. I checked the kitchen, and there it was, hidden behind cereal boxes, like I'd stashed it in a trance. Hands trembling, I set it up again. The hum returned, and so did the dizziness. The message said to disrupt the field abruptly. I grabbed a hammer from the counter. Smashing it seemed like the best bet, but as I raised it, a voice boomed in my head. "Don't, you'll regret it." I froze. Who's there? "I'm you, from another timeline. You linked us with that device. Break it, and I'll vanish into nothing." That made my head spin. What? "I've been living your life through you, like you've lived mine. Disconnect us, and I'm gone." "I can't keep going like this," I whispered. "I'm falling apart." "There's another way," the voice said. "Merge with me, combine our minds, and our knowledge." "No," I shot back. That sounded worse than anything. "Then take the chance," it said, voice fading. I hesitated. What if smashing it wiped me out too? But I couldn't live with this invasion. With a yell, I slammed the hammer down. A blinding flash erupted, and darkness swallowed me. When I opened my eyes, I was on the floor, the device in pieces. The dizziness was gone. No voices, no visions, just silence. It worked, or so I thought. Days later, I noticed my grasp on Proton slipping. The clarity I'd gained faded, leaving me as confused as ever. Worse yet, I felt hollow, like I'd lost something vital. Maybe it was that other me, cut off forever. Years have passed, and I've never told a soul. I steer clear of physics now, sticking to safer stuff. But late at night, when it's quiet, I wonder if that other version of me is still out there, trapped in some parallel void, staring back through the protons that once connected us. And every time I think about it, a cold shiver runs down my spine. One time in school, our science class was divided into groups where each group had to put on a skit about a different topic. I formed a group with my three friends, Tim, David, and Tony, and while we almost went with lab safety since that seemed easiest, eventually we settled on parts of an atom. Little did we know that our decision would prove fateful. Ultimately, we were just a bunch of high school kids in a small-town school, stuck in a science class with a teacher, Mr. Jenkins, who loved hands-on projects a little too much. Our group figured a skit about the atom would be simple: protons, neutrons, electrons, and maybe a goofy costume or two. But Tony, the intense one of the group, had other ideas. "Let's do something big," he said, his eyes lighting up. "How about we reenact Ernest Rutherford's gold foil experiment? You know, the one that discovered the proton?" It sounded ambitious, but we liked the idea of standing out. Tim, the laid-back skeptic, shrugged and said, "As long as I don't have to wear tights." David, our tech guy, was already sketching out how to build a model. Me? I was just happy to be along for the ride. We ended up splitting the work. Tim and I wrote the script, David rigged up a basic setup with stuff from the lab, and Tony dove into research. A couple of days later, he showed up looking weird, pale, fidgety, clutching an old leather book he'd found in the school library. It had no title, just ER scratched into the cover. "It's from one of Rutherford's assistants," he said, flipping it open. The pages were yellowed, filled with tight handwriting and diagrams. At first, it was just boring science stuff, but then Tony pointed out some entries that gave us pause. Day 14, the gold foil experiment continues to yield fascinating results, but I can't shake the feeling that we're tampering with forces beyond our understanding. Last night, I heard whispers in the lab, though I was alone. Day 22, Rutherford dismisses my concerns, but I've seen shadows moving where there should be none. And the Geiger counter spikes at odd hours, as if detecting an unseen presence. Day 30, I fear we've opened a door that cannot be closed. The protons, they seem to be the key, but to what? I must stop this before it's too late. Tim laughed, calling it creepy fanfiction, but David and I exchanged uneasy looks. Still, we had a skit to do, so we pushed forward. We decided to build a mini version of the experiment, nothing crazy, just an old Geiger counter, some metal sheets for foil, and a weak radioactive source Mr. Jenkins approved. We rehearsed in the school's ancient science lab, a room with peeling paint and shelves of dusty equipment no one had touched in decades. But that's when things started to get strange. The Geiger counter started clicking randomly, even when we weren't using the source. Tim swore he saw shadows darting across the walls, but David blamed the flickering lights. Tony, though, he was the real problem. He got obsessed, staying late in the lab, scribbling notes from the journal, muttering about protons being the key. By the day of the skit, he looked like a ghost, hollow-eyed, twitchy, and barely speaking. The classroom was packed when we started. We explained the atom's parts, then moved to the experiment. David set up the apparatus, Tony narrated as Rutherford, and I fed him lines. The Geiger counter ticked steadily, until it didn't. A low hum vibrated through the room, the lights dimmed, and the air felt thick, like before a thunderstorm. Then, as David adjusted the source, a blinding blue flash exploded from the setup. Kids screamed, the room went dark, and when the lights flickered back on, Tony was gone. Where he'd stood was a scorch mark, black and jagged, stinking of burnt metal. Panic broke out. Students bolted, and Mr. Jenkins yelled for calm, and the school went into lockdown. They searched literally everywhere, classrooms, hallways, even the woods behind the building, but Tony vanished. The official report called it an electrical fault and claimed Tony ran off, but we saw the truth in that scorch mark. That night, Tim, David, and I met up, the journal between us like a cursed relic. We found a passage that made our blood run cold. The protons are not merely particles, they are the gatekeepers. Disturb their equilibrium, and you risk tearing the fabric between worlds. Another entry offered a sliver of hope. I've devised a way to reverse the rift, but it requires precise replication of the experiment under specific conditions. Midnight during a new moon, with the apparatus oriented to magnetic north. A new moon was 2 nights away, and we knew we had to get Tony back. Breaking into the school was terrifying. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a scream, but we set up the experiment again, following the journal exactly. At midnight, we flipped the switch. The hum returned, louder and angrier this time. Shadows twisted on the walls, and an icy wind tore through the sealed room. Then, with a sound like glass shattering, the scorch mark flared and Tony stumbled out, collapsing in a heap. His clothes were charred, his skin clammy, and when he grabbed me, his voice was a ragged whisper. "They're still here. The gatekeepers. They followed me back." Before we could process it, the Geiger counter went berserk, its needle slamming against the max. The lights strobed, and in the flashes we saw them, shadowy shapes, tall and warped, their edges flickering like bad TV static. We ran, dragging Tony with us, and didn't stop until we were safe in Tim's basement. Tony wouldn't talk about where he'd been, but he was different, quiet, jumpy, and plagued by nightmares he'd wake from screaming. We burned the journal, hoping it'd end things, but it didn't. Late at night, I still hear faint clicks, like a Geiger counter picking up something no one else can see. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch those distorted figures, watching from the shadows and waiting for us to slip up again. We thought protons were just science, and we were wrong. They're gatekeepers, and we let something through that doesn't belong here. A few months ago, I decided to switch from Windows to Linux, a move I'd been thinking about for some time. One of the big reasons I'd held off was because I'd heard gaming on Linux was a bit iffy, but after finding out about Proton, I decided to give it a try. Proton, Valve's compatibility layer, promised to bridge the gap between Windows games and Linux, and I was excited to dive in. I installed Linux Mint, set up Steam, and enabled Proton. To my surprise, my library lit up with green checkmarks. Most of my games were ready to go. I felt like I'd cracked some secret code to gaming freedom. For the first couple of weeks, everything was perfect. I was tearing through Doom Eternal and The Witcher 3 with no issues, marveling at how smooth Proton made the transition. But then I decided to revisit an old favorite, Fear, a classic horror shooter known for its unsettling AI and creepy little girl, Alma. I'd played it years ago on Windows, so I figured it'd be a nostalgic thrill on my new setup. The game launched fine, and I got lost in its dark corridors and jump scares. But, about an hour in, I noticed something off. The AI enemies, those eerie soldiers, started behaving strangely. They'd stop mid-fight, turn their heads toward my screen, and just stare. Not at my character, but at me. I tried my best to brush it off as a glitch, maybe Proton misrendering some animations, but it still gave me chills. Then the whisper started. Faint, distorted voices leaked from my headphones during quiet moments in the game, words I couldn't quite make out, like static mixed with distant screams. I checked my audio settings, thinking it was a driver issue, but everything looked normal. I told myself it was just the game's atmosphere messing with my head and kept playing. However, things only got worse the next night. I was deep into a level when my monitor flickered, and for a split second I saw Alma, the game's ghostly antagonist, standing in the corner of my desktop outside the game window. I blinked and she was gone. My heart started to race. I alt-tabbed to check, but it was just my wallpaper, no trace of her. Shaking it off, I went back to the game, but now the whispers were louder, forming fragments of sentences. You brought me here, and not just a game. By the third night, the line between the game and reality started to blur. I'd quit Fear for the evening, but as I was browsing the web, my mouse cursor jerked across the screen on its own, opening a blank text document. Slowly, letters typed themselves out. I'm free now. I yanked the mouse out of the USB port, but the typing continued until I hard shut the system down. When I rebooted, the text file was gone, but my Steam library had changed. Every game icon was replaced with Alma's pale, eyeless face. I felt like I was starting to lose it. That night, I woke up to my PC powering on by itself, the fans whirring louder than usual. The screen glowed with Fear's main menu, but the music was warped, slow, and guttural. I unplugged everything and hid under my covers, convincing myself I was imagining things. But in the morning, I found scratches on my desk, thin, jagged lines like fingernails had clawed at the wood. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening was tied to Proton and Fear. I tried uninstalling the game, but Steam crashed every time I clicked on install. Worse, my system started acting possessed. Files I hadn't touched were renamed with gibberish, like almaseesyou.txt, and my webcam light flickered on randomly, even though I disabled it in the BIOS. One night, I even caught a glimpse of my webcam feed on the screen, my room empty, except for a faint silhouette in the corner that vanished when I turned to look. The breaking point came when I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate taps, coming from inside my apartment. For the record, I lived alone. Grabbing a flashlight, I searched every room, but found nothing. When I returned to my desk, my monitor displayed a single frame from Fear, Alma, inches from the screen, her skeletal hands pressed against the glass as if trying to push through. Then the speakers erupted with a scream so loud my neighbors banged on the wall. I ripped the power cord out, but the scream lingered in my ears. Terrified, I emailed Valve support with a frantic subject line, "Proton is haunted, help me." I attached logs, screenshots of the warped desktop, and even a shaky phone video of my PC turning on by itself. The first reply was generic, check for malware, update drivers, etc., but I fired back with more evidence, begging them to escalate it. Days passed with no response, and the disturbances grew worse. My lights flickered in sync with the game's audio cues, and my phone started getting notifications from Steam with no text, just Alma's face. Finally, I got a reply from an unexpected source, Gabe Newell. The email was short but direct. "We've seen your logs. This is serious. Our team is on it. Hang tight." I couldn't believe it. Gabe freaking Newell was personally involved. But I didn't have time to process it. That night, my apartment went pitch black, power surging as my PC booted up again. The screen showed Fear, but now Alma was outside the game entirely, pacing my desktop, her head twitching unnaturally. A voice, hers, hissed through the speakers, "You can't stop me." Just as I was about to smash the damn thing with a hammer, another email from Gabe arrived. Attached was a beta patch for Proton labeled Emergency Fix 0.1. His instructions were clear. Install this now. It seals a back door we found. Don't ask how it got there. Just trust us. My hand shook as I plugged the PC back in, Alma's image still glaring from the screen. I ran the patch installer and the system locked up, the progress bar crawling. Then, all hell broke loose. The monitor shook, the speakers blared a distorted mix of Alma's screams and static, and the room grew freezing cold. Shadows stretched across my walls, forming her shape. I gripped the desk, whispering, "Come on, come on." At 99%, the screen went black, and a final, ear-splitting shriek tore through the air. Then, silence. The system rebooted, and was pristine. Fear launched normally, with Alma seemingly confined to her scripted haunts. My desktop was back to its boring old self. A week later, a package arrived from Valve, a Steam Deck, which I thought was ironic since this all started with Proton. But there was also a handwritten note from Gabe saying, "Sorry for the scare. You helped us catch a nasty exploit. Enjoy this on us." There was a patch changelog detailing a critical privilege escalation flaw in Proton that let game code hijack system resources. They'd rolled out the fix globally, but I'd been the unlucky guinea pig who found it the hard way. I'm back to gaming on Linux now, mostly sticking to lighter titles. But every so often, when I boot up Steam, I catch a faint flicker in the corner of my screen, a pixelated blur that's gone when I look twice. I tell myself it's nothing, just my nerves, but still, I keep that hammer close by, just in case.